Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Business Continuity Exercise Planning and Facilitation Techniques to Start Now. I'm Jennifer Getz, the Editorial Director of Continuity Insights, and this webinar is presented by Riskonnect. Before we get started, I'll cover a few housekeeping items. There will be a question and answer segment at the end of the presentation today. Please find the question box in the dashboard on your screen. This is where you can submit questions for our speaker today. If at any time you experience a technical difficulty, please send us a message via that question section and someone on our team will answer you privately. Now, without further ado, I'm happy to introduce your speaker for today. Andrew Morkot, a seasoned business continuity professional based in Newcastle, UK, brings over 30 years of experience in resilience. His career spans leadership and consulting roles in business continuity, risk, audit, security, incident, and disaster management. Thank you for joining us today, Andrew. Take it away.
Very much for joining the call. So so obviously we're here today to talk about exercises, and of course we have an agenda. So the agenda, as you can see on screen, and I will read it through and then we can jump into the purpose of the presentation. So how to facilitate engaging exercises. Often than not, people are sent to exercises, they don't necessarily want to be there, and I think it's really important when we run an exercise that we make sure that we try to be as engaging as we possibly can and make sure exercises are fun if they possibly can be, and people genuinely get something from that exercise. And we want to make sure people are involved and make sure decisions are made in those exercises so that we can take them away and use them for business continuity, planning, and continual improvement. Everybody's made mistakes. Common pitfalls, we all make them. There are little rabbit holes, and there are things that it's really important to make sure we minimize as we go through an exercise. So we're going to look a little bit at those common pitfalls to make sure that we don't make them, and make sure that we capture the information. So executing pre and post exercise activities to make sure that once we learn something in an exercise, we can actually take it away and make sure we update those business continuity plans. And again, evaluating success. So we have overlords, we have bosses, and they want to know how well the exercises went. And certainly from things like an audit perspective, we want to make sure that we can demonstrate that we are continually improving our business continuity program over time. So that's the agenda. That's what we're going to go through today. So before we go any further, I guess, I think we should probably talk about what the standards say about exercising. So there's a little excerpt there from one of the standards. I think it's the BCI standard. The ISO 22301 standard. And essentially the purpose of an exercise, as it says here, is to confirm that a business continuity procedure is fit for purpose and that everything in the BCMS fits together. So that's expanded a little bit with operational resilience, because we want to make sure that from an end-to-end perspective, all the way from the market and from the customer, all the way down into the roots of the organization, that all parts of that daisy chain of dependency works together, and we have identified where there might be failings. So when we talk about validation, I think one of the things that's of course always true is nothing's really ready until it's been tested. And when we think about exercises generally, and if you've never run an exercise before, this is kind of for you. Exercises don't have to be smooth to be successful. So sometimes when we take, especially someone like a senior team, into an exercise, it can be very chaotic, because this may be the first time they've ever been in an exercise, and they want to, if you like, run by the seat of their pants, and they, fix any kind of issue the way they always have, putting on the emergency t-shirt, shutting the door, and resolving the problem. So it's really important to recognize that even though an exercise at the beginning is chaotic, it's not necessarily that problematic. It'll certainly get their attention. After an exercise, it may well be that people are, stressed, and, we'll need to take that, and we need to leverage that to make sure that all of that energy and pressure goes into making sure that things are improved over time. So when we think about validation, it's a good idea to start off with something really simple. So we don't need, like you'd imagine, we don't really need a ransomware attack. We don't need something that's multifaceted or hugely complex to start an incident management team, or running an exercise about a crisis right at the beginning. Things can get more complex over time. So it's a good idea to start with something simple and make sure that when we run the exercise, people get a good feeling from it. As I said, people can be surprised by the complexity of an incident and how it affects their business. So giving them small successes, making sure that they go away from the exercise feeling good about themselves and feeling good about their preparation is a really important key thing to do. Awareness. So ensuring the relevant personnel are familiar with their roles in the event of a disruption. As a kind of an ex-auditor, it's often it's said of auditors that one of the things that an auditor will do, especially around sort of the ISO standards, is walk up to anyone in the business and say to them, what is your role in a business continuity incident? So awareness is really important so that everybody who's involved in a major incident response or any kind of other exercise really is a good understanding of what their role is in that emergency. And of course, it can be reflected back if anybody asks that question. So it's really important when we talk about training to give people hands-on experience. As I said, this may be the first time that anybody's ever been involved in anything like a crisis. So making sure that they're able to understand their role, maybe understand the purpose of business continuity and the drive within the organization to be more resilient, and find out how to use their business continuity plan, obviously, importantly. So it's really important that people get the opportunity to carry out this training. And of course, identification of gaps. This is where we obviously spot any weaknesses. I talked before about that daisy chain, all the way up from the market or the customer, all the way down into the roots of the organization. This is where we find those gaps. And when we think about what we're going to do about those gaps, we can take those out as corrective actions straight out of the exercise and use those to improve the business continuity plans. And obviously, over time, we can demonstrate from an ISO perspective, we can demonstrate that continual improvement over time. And of course, the last one is their continual improvement, of course. So essentially turning those unknown unknowns into known unknowns. So now we know what we didn't know before. Now we know where we're weak. Now we know where we have to have improvements, and then we know we're not prepared going forward. And as I said before, we can leverage all of that energy to making sure that shortly after the exercise has taken place, we can capture it all with either a hot or warm or cold debrief. And then we can make sure that all of those corrective actions that have been created coming out of an exercise are acted upon, are given ownership to individuals, and we can make sure that the exercise and the purpose of that exercise has been achieved, as I say, through all of those corrective actions. So that's kind of what standards say about incident exercising and why we do them. So if we're all familiar with essentially Kipling and those 6 honest serving men, who, what, when, where, how, and why, if we think about those questions, every single one of those questions needs to be answered correctly or answered fully in order to have a successful exercise. So if we think about at the beginning, who's going to be involved in an exercise, this can go several ways. Of course, we want to make sure that if let's say we're running a C-suite exercise, we want to have the C-suite in the room, but that can go, as I say, that can go several different ways. Do we want leadership in the room? Often it can have different effects. It can energize people, it can get people more involved, and it can energize the players, maybe people rising to the occasion, making maximum effort and getting more out of the exercise. But equally, who's in the room can hamper an exercise as well. Nobody wants to look bad in front of the CEO or their big boss, or they will defer to them. So what, if we're asking questions in an exercise, we just need to make sure that there is it's kind of a Chatham House rules atmosphere in the exercise where we leave our hats at the door, and nothing that's said within that exercise is attributable. And another thing about who is making sure that when we run an exercise, and this actually leads into running an incident, that we make sure that the right people have the voice and the right people are managing and running, let's say, an incident management team. So if you are exercising an incident management team, is the right person to be the leader of that the CEO? That may not be the case. In a lot of exercises I've run in the past, the CEO will take charge, will be the single sole voice of authority within that exercise or within that incident. And that can lead to a lot of groupthink, and it can lead to a lot of single-minded behavior where we will lead, the CEO will lead to an inevitable conclusion of theirs. And that can stifle creativity, and it can stifle the approach, and certainly it can weaken the resilience approach that we're looking for when we talk about a crisis management team. So that's the who, and obviously we need to make sure that we involve the right teams. And it could be that an incident management team, or sorry, a crisis management exercise runs at several levels. So when we think about who, it could be externally with suppliers. They could be phoning in, or they could be on site providing input into the exercise. You could have teams, both the C-suite team, but also, if you like, those silver and bronze teams, those reporting lines, those tactical and operational teams involved in those exercises. So it doesn't necessarily just need to be one level, it can be multi-level. The next thing on the agenda really for this is kind of, what are we exercising? So we need to make sure when we talk about what we're going to exercise, that we keep things realistic and prescient and of the now. So obviously, before COVID-19 hit us, we may well have been talking about pandemic planning, but we weren't talking about pandemic planning in anything like the way it, the way it panned out. But we need to make sure that when we're talking about the what, that we think about who we're talking to and the organization that we're talking to, and make sure that it's relevant, of course, relevant to them. It could be a natural disaster, could be cyber attacks, and just like I said, we need to just make sure that when we're talking about what we're testing, that we keep it within the realms of the maturity of that part of the business, or the maturity of the exercise program that we are dealing with in that organization. We don't want something to be too complicated, but we just need to make sure that we have procedures in place. We have the response capabilities tested, roles and responsibilities for those actions are tested within a major incident exercise, or any kind of exercise really. Communications, how people communicate internally, again, with the resilience capability. What are we testing? We're testing resources, so tools and ways to manage an incident, ways to communicate internally and externally, and making sure that the decision-making process is properly fleshed out and examined within an exercise. So we want to know how people communicate internally, how they make decisions. Do they have tactical authority to make a strategic decision, let's say, if they don't have access to a gold team? So it's really important when we think about what, that all of those elements, are considered. And then, of course, when do we run an exercise? Well, obviously, the exercises can be run ad hoc. You can surprise people with a key exercise, or they can be run annually or regularly. And it depends on the part of the business that you're talking to, how regularly those exercises need to be run, and the complexity of them. It may well be something like an IT team that we run quite simple operational level exercises to ensure that we have those resilience and restoration capabilities for each of those, if you like, those P1 applications. And it may well be that once every 5 years we run a full drill, with the emergency services and external third-party agencies involved. So when we run that, we need to make sure that when we think about this, we think about the business itself. So we want to avoid pressure periods. So Cyber Week, for instance, we want to avoid that because people are very busy. They won't want to be engaged in that exercise. And equally, we want to avoid the summer holidays when we can't get anybody available to run that exercise. So when end of year is sometimes a good time to set an exercise. It's not necessarily a good time to run an exercise. Business as usual is often a good time to set an exercise, because we can say today's the day, and it's a completely normal day in the middle of October, and then we can look at that exercise without any of the complexity that you would get with those pressure periods around Christmas, around end of year, around sort of Cyber Week, or any of those things if they're in retail. We can also run exercises that are designated to start at the weekend, or out of hours, or midnight on Christmas Day. So if we think about what we're trying to achieve with an exercise, we like to think about when we want to have that exercise. Most of the time, no one's at work. it's only just between 8 and 5 p.m., 5 days a week, there's anyone there. So when we think about an exercise, let's think about it not being during the day. And as I say, it can be weekends and it can be midnight. And obviously, thinking further, we think about where we're going to run an exercise. Before COVID, it was a case that we had people in rooms, and it was very easy to get people at an office facilitating an exercise in front of people, with a PowerPoint and a stick. But nowadays, that's different. So we need to make sure that when we're thinking about that, we either use things like off-site facilities. We of course we can house these exercises at local hotels with business centers, or we can sort of rent an office space that's not necessarily where they might be during the day, because it may well be, if you're thinking about a loss of facility scenario, that we want to have people in a place that's not familiar to them. It may be at desk if they are considering an at desk. If you're considering an at desk exercise, we just literally drop that exercise onto people right in the middle of a normal day, and they will be dealing with that at desk. And of course, one of the things to remember about that is that whilst especially the C-suite are running an exercise, they're also having to deal with the day job as well. So it may well be that you have a critical loss of a piece of technology, but also they have the rest of the organization as a bit on a BAU to run as well. So we can't necessarily take an entire C-suite and remove them and put them in a room and say, hey, we're now going to run an exercise, because the rest of the business still has to run. And of course, nowadays, when we're using Zoom and Teams and all of those things, you've got breakouts, you've got facilities with these pieces of software where you can actually segment, segment response teams virtually. And it's possible to run an exercise completely remote, obviously virtually, like we are today. So that's kind of the where. How, whoops, go back. How, of course, we can run live, tabletop, plan walkthrough. Of course, there are different ways in which we can run this, and we need to make sure that when we are running these exercises, that we are aware and sensitive to any of the issues that the organization is running right now. So when in the run up to an exercise, we need to think and talk to those parts of the business that we're going to exercise and say, is this still a good time? We're going to be thinking about running this exercise in 2 weeks or next week or next Tuesday. Is this still the right time to be doing this? Or are you facing another crisis that we need to perhaps postpone? And of course, live exercises, tabletops, or plan walkthroughs are there for you to be able to decide exactly what we're trying to achieve from this. And this goes about back to what are we trying to achieve. So if we're trying to do a plan walkthrough, that's a very different type of exercise to dropping people into a room and saying, right now we've got an incident scenario which we need to deal with. So how we run that exercise is really important. And lastly, we've got kind of the why question. So of course, we run exercises because it's a good idea, right? So we run exercises to make sure that as an organization, we become more resilient over time. But that's often not good enough. People have a day job, they're looking at, their own KPIs and their own goals for that year, and exercising might not be something that they necessarily want to prioritize. So we can leverage things like ISO certification. So we need to use that as a lever to get people into the room and make sure that when we're doing an exercise, we are actually addressing parts of the ISO standards or whatever due diligence that they may need to accomplish. And of course, when we talk about that, we talk about diligence and audit requirements. We're also talking about things like SLAs from key customers. Often, of course, businesses will be asked by their key customers to demonstrate capability within their resilience structure, and exercise results and exercise success is a very good way to be able to demonstrate to an organization, a key customer, that the resilience infrastructure is well embedded in the organization. So that's kind of an overview of how, why, what, when, where, how, who we run an exercise. So I hope that makes sense. And obviously, I'll be very interested to see if there's any questions at the end, and we can dig into that in a little bit more detail. So I guess one of the next things to think about is around facilitating an exercise. So One of the key things, and I know that for a lot of people on the call, I'll perhaps be sort of teaching granny to suck eggs, but it's really important that when we think about practicing an exercise, we're not just thinking about making sure that you're able to speak effectively and your voice carries and you have a microphone and all of those elements. We want to make sure that, you know, the exercise actually chimes well with the audience. So getting a friendly department in to practice an exercise is really important, and we don't run into an exercise completely cold. So once we've got the technology in place and the room is available and the lighting's right and all of the other things that we can control are there, we need to make sure that when we run a scenario that it's been tested. So if you think about the questions you might get, you won't expect some of these questions, and often these could otherwise be showstoppers. People don't like being taken out of their comfort zones, so you should expect kickback when you run an exercise, especially a disaster scenario or something that, you know, presents people with a situation they've never seen before. You'll obviously get people. I have had people myself saying that wouldn't happen. That's crazy. We would be able to mitigate for that very easily using X, Y, Z. I think one of the things that we always talk about when we run exercises is that saying of don't fight the scenario. The scenario really is just to get you to a situation of disruption. So of course, it's great to have a scenario that chimes well and they can believe in, but actually, even if you're running an exercise, notwithstanding the fact that you need to be flexible when you're running it, it's always important to be able to reference that fact of don't fight the scenario. It could be anything that gets us to this point where we have lost that. And if you think about kind of the three elements of what we call Murphy's Law, first part of that is, which we all recognize, is whatever can go wrong will go wrong. And the second and third parts of Murphy's Law are essentially whatever is going to go wrong will go wrong at the worst possible time. It's going to be Christmas Day in a snowstorm during a period of sickness, and there's no one available. So that's the second part of Murphy's Law. And I think the last one is probably the most important when we talk about making sure that the scenario is credible, is the third part of Murphy's Law, which says, even if it can't go wrong, it did, or it will. So as I said, making sure that people are aware of the fact that just the scenario itself is not something to be hung up on. So making sure you've practiced and making sure that you have done that in front of a live audience of people who understand the business that you're trying to test. So I think that's really important. Secondarily, of course, we need to have rules, right? So right at the beginning of this, I talked about what we call Chatham House rules. And essentially, Chatham House rules are leave it at the door, right? So as much as you possibly can, we want people to both entertain the scenario, but also be blind to the people in the room. And that's often very difficult to do. And that kind of goes back to who we want who we want involved in the exercise. What we don't want to do when we're planning and running an exercise is to have, you know, the C-suite overpopulating the exercise so that everybody else there might feel either pressured to do well or just won't speak at all. So we need to make sure that we're careful about how we run an exercise and who's going to be involved. And one of the things is leave business as usual to your team. Right. So what we don't want to have is people coming into the exercise with their phone half engaged, half not. And one of the slides that we're going to talk about in a moment is how to re-engage those people who have switched off because they've already outthought the exercise. But that's, when we talk about having scenarios, it's always good to have another scenario in your back pocket so that when your first scenario either dies a death, in other words, people have said, yeah, we've solved that. It's only 20 minutes into the exercise. Can we go now? That you were able to say, well, actually, in this particular scenario, this has happened as well, or we need to make the exercise slightly more complex or look at it a different way because we have you here now. We want to make sure that we've taken you outside business as usual. Another rule is if you have to take a call, do it out of the room. That's standard procedure, but often you'll get people who start chattering away on their mobile phone. And when that happens, the entire room stops and listens to that conversation, and it will stop your exercise dead in the water. So we need to make sure that there are ground rules like that. Leave it at the door, leave your, ask your team to take over when you're in that exercise, so you won't be called out unnecessarily. Don't fight the scenario. It's there just to get you to the point where you are in a situation you have to deal with outside standard operating procedures. So it's really important that people engage, take it seriously, treat the exercise like it's a real event, and try and enjoy it as much as possible. So it's not real. It could be real tomorrow, but as much as we possibly can, we want to make sure that the next time we ask somebody for an exercise, that they're actually going to attend. Next thing, obviously use visuals. I mean, this slide's a great example of not making slides too complicated. We've all been, and I hate PowerPoint. It's one of the banes of my life, if I'm being honest. But we use it. Everyone uses PowerPoint. But the problem with PowerPoint is it's very capable of producing lots of very interesting slides with lots of moving images, things sliding around all over the place, and lots of text and lots of information on screen. So it's really important when we talk about visuals, we use images. If you think about, famously sort of Steve Jobs and Apple and the sort of the launch of their iPhones and the iPad and etc. There's almost nothing on the slide, and it's all about the engagement of the presenter. This guy you can see on screen. It's all about making sure you don't overdo it, that you are engaging, but make sure that the visuals you have actually tell a story. The last thing you want to have is popping things up on screen and having people read behind you what you're trying to tell them. Even if you have things like a delayed presentation like we have here, we want to make sure that we focus on the information that's available and we don't put too much of that onto the presentation deck if you're running, as I say, if you're running PowerPoint. Use charts and graphs. Obviously, pictures speak 1,000 words. If you can find something where you can develop things like dashboarding that show a particular situation, use that, leave it up on screen, and people can refer to that in the exercise. If you can't leave it on screen, print it out. Have A1 sized printouts of any of those dashboards that you're trying to talk about. So it gives people a reference point and keeps them engaged in the particular concept that we're trying to talk about. And again, keep it simple, uncluttered visuals. They will really support your message and make sure that people stay engaged. And try as much as you can to make it interesting. We can all find the most boring pictures, but if we find a picture that's either amusing or entertaining or something that is quite arresting, it's always good to use presentation materials that are like that. Make it more memorable, and if you have to sort of use a bit of Photoshop, etc., I think everybody is able to do something like that. It's really good to be able to come up with a presentation that has visual impact. The last thing I think is really important is make sure that when we're pacing an exercise, that you slow down, take your time, don't rush points, make sure that you give everyone and everything in that room the attention it deserves. So, of course, it could be chaotic, but we need to make sure that we try and calm that chaos, especially in something like a major incident exercise or major incident scenario, that we make sure that we depressurize the room so that everybody has the opportunity to speak. We take the opportunity to pause and reflect. So when we're running an exercise, it's a great thing to do to have an exercise stop clock, to just say, we're now going to stop the exercise for 5 minutes. We can review, people can run away for 5 minutes if they need to, and we'll come back and we'll review where we are right now. And that we don't run an exercise continually from start to finish, perhaps like you would in a normal scenario. Or if it's something that's long running. So if you're thinking about an exercise that's going to be running for a situation that's going to be running for 5 days, you can say day 1, we're now going to pause for 20 minutes. We're going to discuss and review and reflect. And then we're going to move on to next part of the exercise, which is day 2. And one of the things also is reflection as well, is making sure that there's good understanding in the room about what we're trying to achieve. So just saying, does everybody understand, might not get you there, because people, especially if there's the CEOs in the room, people aren't going to say anything. So we need to make sure that when we are saying, does everybody understand, are we all on the same page? Do we understand what we've done and why we've done it and what the implications might be, that we make sure that we're not just presenting, that we're actually asking good searching questions to make sure that there is good understanding in the room. And then, of course, focusing on one idea at a time. We need to make sure that we don't overload and overcomplicate a situation, because what we're trying to do is test those discrete elements of the exercise that we're trying to ensure that we have clarity on, and we don't overfog the issue, or we don't put in too much complexity. So keep things simple, take your time, speak clearly, pause and reflect, make sure that you're doing that feedback, making sure that there's check for understanding. And as I say, don't rush. Obviously, there are time limits on exercises, but we're far better off capturing things effectively than rushing through it and making sure that we haven't captured things. So again, that's kind of making sure how to facilitate an engaging exercise, right? Have fun, make sure that people want to come next time, make sure that you've captured things effectively. The last thing that people want to know, want to see, is that they've spent a load of time, especially if you're talking about senior leadership, they've spent a load of time coming to this exercise, preparing for it, putting in feedback. They need to know that that was actually effective, and the time they've spent has been well spent. So you need to make sure that when we talk about after events, that there is something tangible coming out of this exercise, that there is a post-exercise report with findings, with corrective actions, all of those things that they would expect to see. It's really important that when we run an exercise and we're finished, we don't just slap ourselves on the back and say, wasn't that great? Tick an audit box and move on. It's really important that when we are running an exercise with a purpose, that we capture those results and make sure that they are available for everybody who attended, so that they understand that their time was well spent. Hopefully that makes sense. So inspiring involvement and decision making. So essentially, what I would say about this really is it's important to listen, right? So if we're talking about listening, we really need to make sure that that's a two-way active process, and we need to really listen to what people are saying. Most often conversation is just waiting for your opportunity to talk. So when people are talking in an exercise scenario, it's really important to make sure that you look like and you are actively listening to what they're saying. Obviously, observers help in that. So if it doesn't have to just be you, it can be a multiple team. So you can have people who are players and, if you like, facilitators, or facilitators and observers. And if that becomes too much, make sure people have the opportunity to jot things down on a post-it, put it up on the wall, so that we can, if people don't feel like they are able to express perhaps because of the volume in the room, or perhaps because there's certain individuals in the room, have an anonymous wall, so that you can say, anybody who has an idea about this, use the yellow post-its, we'll review that in our breakout zones, in our breakout times. We'll review what you've said, obviously Chatham House, fully anonymized, so that we can just make sure that we have captured everything and we don't just rely on the loud voices in the room. And I think one thing that's really important as well is, someone once said to me, read the room, Andrew. We get it, right? So once you've made a point, even if you've got a load of information to go onto the back of that point in that exercise, if it looks like, and with a lot of people, they got it before you even finish the sentence, make sure that you stop, right? So don't labor a point, don't kick it to death. If someone in the room understands what it is we're trying to say, stop there and move on. But one of the worst things is, like what I'm doing here, is over laboring and over kicking a point to death to make sure that everybody gets it. If they get it, move on. Another thing that's really important too is to listen. Again, talking about listening, listen to their stories, give people the opportunity to tell you when they were involved in a particular incident or a particular scenario, or when something happened to them where they felt that they were, stressed, or in an emergency scenario, or whatever it might be. Because often those scenarios are better than your scenario, or can add to that scenario. So it's really important that you give people the space and opportunity to talk. Of course, we talk about, time available for an exercise. And I think we just need to make sure that we allow that time, allow that space for people to express their, their history, things that they've experienced in the past. And as I say, things that might be a better or more logical scenario than the one we're actually dealing with in this exercise. And I think checking for understanding is really important when we listen. Show you're listening, be active, all of those kind of body language things that we've all been taught. Nod, ask questions, clarify, ask for feedback, all those things. Make sure that people understand that you're engaged and you're not just a stuffed shirt standing in front of them presenting an exercise to them. It's really important that we let people finish, that they feel engaged, they feel involved, and we allow that space for them to be fully engaged in the exercise. One of the more important things as well when we're running an exercise and talking about decision making is kind of don't over dramatize. We all like to think about alien attacks and killer wasps and all of the terrible things that could occur. But we just need to make sure that we're sharing the facts. We don't over dramatize, we don't oversell it, we don't tell them stories about how this is all so awful and we need to respond. We just need to tell them the facts. These are senior people in the main, when we're talking to sort of the C-suite, etc. They get it. As I say, they understand what we're talking about. Be honest as well. So when we're talking about an exercise in a scenario, try not to hype things up, but also don't sugarcoat things. If we're talking about a scenario that has, deep and meaningful implications for the organization, it's okay to say so. So if we were to say, if this happens, this is going to be the result. It's dramatic, but it's true. So we just need to make sure that we don't overhype, but again, equally, we don't sugarcoat problems. And making sure that they understand really what it is that we're trying to achieve. So kind of focus on teaching and informing and not just persuading. So we need to make sure that we're not trying to lead them into our narrative, that we're actually making them think about the problem for themselves, so that when we're not there, and when, as a BC team or whoever it might be, that they're able to have learned those lessons from a major incident response and they can manage it themselves. And be natural, right? So try it as much as you possibly can. Be honest, be natural, use your own anecdotes. We've all got a bucket full of anecdotes and funny memories of when things have happened to us. So as I say, as much as you possibly can, with a room full of senior people, try and be as engaged and honest and be yourself, essentially. So that's kind of telling, don't selling. I think it's really important when we're talking about running an exercise for a senior team that we say we a lot, right? So that it's essentially we bring them into our world. So it's not you are the crisis management team, we are the crisis management team. So we have this issue. It's essentially, as soon as it's a psychology thing. If we say we, it's you and me, we're all in the same boat together, and it enables people to feel more engaged with an exercise. So avoid saying you, avoid to thinking about that team as a third party or as an abstract. We are in this room together as we are trying to engage this particular incident. So as I say, use we a lot. Use inclusive language. Make them feel that they're part of the response. Try to promote kind of a shared purpose through the presentation. So whilst we're trying to make sure that people understand their own individual goals, that may be a communications team, an HR, a legal team, an internal communications, external communications team. They are a team, right? So it's very easy when we run an exercise to compartmentalize people and say, you have this responsibility, you have that responsibility, and you have that responsibility. And what that will lead to, if you're not careful, is people compartmentalizing themselves and missing the fact that actually corporately we're trying to resolve this problem as a business. So we need to make sure that whilst we give people individual roles and responsibilities, especially in exercises, that we make sure that people are aware and they stay fully engaged in the fact that this is a team response. And lastly, I think on inspiring involvement, it's kind of just be you. You're just one of the team in the room. And I think it's really important that we try to, as much as we can, don't be the stuffed shirt in front of them presenting, that we walk around the room, that we're engaged, we get involved with the scenario, and we just be part of the incident response effort or the incident response exercise. Be yourself, be modest, be honest, all of those things that you would hope to be. That's difficult when you're obviously dealing with, senior people. And I think probably lastly on this slide, kind of enjoy it as much as you possibly can. Try and engage those people so that they enjoy it and have fun too. Because the first thing we want to do is make sure that they come back again. And the last thing we want to do is have people leave the exercise feeling that it wasn't worthwhile, it wasn't realistic, it was a waste of their time, or that they didn't think that it would have the desired effect. So all of those things need to come together to make sure that the next time we run an exercise, people come back and people are engaged. Okay, so hopefully we're okay on time. Okay, so this guy, yeah, we've all been there. We've all sat in front of a presentation and thought, why am I here? This is boring. It doesn't relate to me. And I don't understand the purpose of this exercise. So as I said, it's really important that we have mechanisms in which to try to re-energize the room. And obviously I've got a few here on screen, but it's really important that we read the room and we are able to see when an exercise is starting to fall flat. People are starting to look at their phones. People are making excuses to leave the room and not come back. All those things are indicators that the exercise is losing steam. So one of the things we can do is have interactive polls. So this is a good way of getting people's attention. And ask questions. You can ask questions of an entire room. Use your phone, if you have it there, use your phone, use iPads that are in the room. Ask scenario related questions. And obviously you can use scenario related questions for exercise feedback and exercise results. So you can say, we asked, and you'll have seen this if you've been to conferences recently, you'll have interactive polls where people can answer questions in their dozens, and that will actually come up on screen and we can get feedback and we can use that as an exercise inject. And we can say, right, okay, we've just asked you a question about this incident scenario. So again, Chatham House, all anonymized. What do we think? And we can use those interactive polls to get those answers. Do you understand what we're talking about? Do you understand your role? Do you understand, or do you have any ideas that we can take forward in order to take us past this particular part of the scenario? Interactive polls are really useful for that. Like I said before, just a sip of water. Breakouts. So we've got Teams breakouts, we've got physical breakouts, and we've got stops in time when we're running with a long-winded incident or an incident that's going to last. So we just need to make sure that we have those moments, those breakout teams, and those breakouts can be competitive as well, or semi-competitive in that sense. So we can send people off into individual quadrants or individual teams and ask them to come back with their answers. And it becomes a little bit more of a competitive spirit, even though it's not supposed to be competitive. People will always want to make sure that they've got answers when the other team perhaps might not. So I think making it very interactive, as I say, using polls, using breakouts, is a really effective way of making sure that if an exercise has gone flat, that you can re-energize it. So role play, again, role play is really important. Give people roles. So instead of just saying, we are dealing with this incident scenario, we can say, you are now the communications team, you are now the head of legal, you are now the head of HR, even though they may not be in a real world. So making sure that people have actual roles to play in an exercise can be really effective. And if you put somebody in a CMT position, so you could say, instead of being a member of the HR team, if you like, you're now the head of HR. So I want you to think about how we do this, how we do it, how would you do it? And that can obviously lead to new ideas and new examples. And if we think about different ways in which we can split teams up, you can also have somebody who is a black hat, if you like, somebody whose job it is to tell you that everything's a terrible idea and think of reasons why. So every time we make a decision, we want a black hat in the room to say, yeah, if we do this, all these terrible things are going to happen. So it's important that if we're trying to avoid groupthink and if you like over positivity about when we are trying to get to a conclusion, we need the black hat in the room to say, yep, if we do this, these are going to be the implications. You're all going to prison. So we need to make sure that we have someone in the room who's able to counter that positivity and that energy towards just getting us out of the room and getting us to a solution. So when we think about scenarios and scenario adaptation, make sure you have something else as well. So as I said right at the beginning of this, make sure that you have something else you can fall back on, so that you say, yep, that happened, that's fine. We will now overcomplicate, or we'll move on to another scenario. Or you could say, hey, we've now got BBC News on the line. They want a statement. Who's going to do it? How are we going to put it together? Do we need to pull everybody together, not just the communications team, to pull an incident response for the BBC in? So as I say, having things that will re-energize people is really important. And feedback. I think it's really important to have immediate feedback. So again, interactive polls are really good for that. But obviously feedback from you is really important as well, to say, I understand what you're saying. That's a really great idea. And I'm not being over patronizing, but making sure that people know that they've been heard and know that what they're saying actually makes a difference to the incident response and will be taken forward into the kind of the business continuity planning. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, how you can try to re-engage participants when an exercise inevitably, has either a lull or it starts to go flat. So pitfalls, common pitfalls that we need to think about, I guess. I've lost my slide. Yeah, so objectives, poorly defined objectives, right? We need to make sure that the objectives, when we are setting this exercise and when we present the exercise, that they're clear and unfocused. Sorry, they're clear and focused. If they're unfocused or they're unclear, people are not going to believe in your scenario. We need to make sure that those goals are achievable and measurable, and they will have a measurable output. So make sure that you have clear objectives. Make sure that you've spent enough time in planning this exercise. Make sure that the timelines are right, and make sure that the people you're trying to get into this room are available and you've given them enough time and enough material. Hold those pre-exercise meetings to make sure that everybody's aligned and everybody understands what the goal of this particular exercise is, and address any of those potential pitfalls or issues before they happen. We don't want an exercise where we run into an exercise and we hit an immediate hurdle before we've even started the exercise. Make sure that everybody understands their goals and understands why they're there. So making sure that we have the right people in the room, making sure that the attendance is relevant, briefing and preparation, make sure that essentially that we understand and people have the opportunity to input into a scenario. So we need to make sure that we have provided the right information in advance. Scenarios, make sure the scenarios are realistic. Go back to the beginning when we talked about those scenarios. Just make sure that they are based on their reality in the moment. That, we're not talking about pandemic post-COVID, unless you wanted to revisit that. Make sure that if we're talking about something, we might be talking about supply chain issues with Houthi rebels and the Red Sea. We might be talking about the war in Ukraine. We might be talking about change of administration in the US. Whatever we're talking about, we need to make sure that it's relevant and timely, and that the scenario chimes with what they're trying to, with what they're dealing with on a daily basis. Anything that's not that, well, you'll lose credibility as soon as you're in an exercise. We've all been in exercises where we've had the killer wasps or the alien attack, or 90% sickness rates. People won't engage with that. They'll just think this is an unrealistic scenario. This is just Andrew making something up just to be dramatic. We just need to make sure that it is prescient and people get it and believe it. So, lack of engagement. We talked about how to get people engaged and how to keep people engaged. Make sure that we use interactive elements. Make sure that the exercise is exciting, if you want to use that term, that it's interactive. There's lots of elements to it. There's good visuals. There's interactive feedback. There's breakouts. To make the exercise less chalk and talk, make it less of a presentation and more of an event, if you possibly can. Communications, internal, external, pre-exercise, post-exercise, and during the exercise. Communications is the thing that fails all the time, every time. So making sure that you've communicated effectively before an exercise, you communicate effectively after the exercise, so people feel valued and that they've spent their time effectively, and making sure that when we talk about incident management generally, that we talk about communications. It is one of my hobby horses, that it always is. At a post-incident review, it's always communications, top of the agenda. Someone will say, nobody called me, or after the initial alert, when we said we will contact you on the hour every hour, that happened once and nobody ever spoke to me ever again. So making sure that there's a real focus on communications. Poor information capture is a really important one as well, because when we run an exercise, it's very easy to just get ahead of the moment and actually just be involved in the exercise without making sure there's good information capture in the exercise. It's sometimes really important. If you can record, great, record it. But if you can't record it, have scribes in the room, or have people in the room, have scribes in the room, or have the opportunity for people to write down their feedback as they go. It's difficult often to get people to actually put things down on paper, but if the paper's not there, they're not going to write anything. So if you have forms available for, if you like, real-time feedback and real-time incident element capture, make sure that that stuff is available, make sure that the stationery is available, or make sure that there are designated scribes. If all we're doing is dealing with the incident itself, and we will forget things like recovery and business and return to business as usual. So make sure when you're running an exercise, it's not just about the big bang event and the response and the emergency services and the blue lights and whatever it is you're trying to exercise. Make sure that when we are planning an exercise, that we include recovery and return to normal business as usual, so that after the incident has been resolved, after we've captured all of those learnings, people are confident in their ability to come to work in the following morning in a normal BAU situation. So include that in an exercise. And the last thing here is around debrief and actions. So make sure that after an incident, whether or not you have a hot debrief after the incident, or whether or not you send a survey. Now, of course, we've got SurveyMonkey, we've got all sorts of different ways, Microsoft Forms, lots of different ways in which we can ask questions, that we make sure that we engage with people immediately as quickly as possible to try and make sure that we capture all of those learnings for business continuity plan development, because the purpose of this is all to demonstrate continual improvement over time and make sure that the purpose of the exercise is really achieved, and we can demonstrate that the purpose of the exercise has been really achieved through those debrief actions, and making sure that as I say, the business continuity plans, whatever it might be, are improved over time. So those are essentially the common pitfalls I see when running an exercise, and kind of how to resolve them. So with that, essentially, you will face with an exercise, you will face these emotions, and obviously people will react to these things in different ways. So essentially, inertia. So during a major incident, people will say, I didn't want to call anybody because it could have got better. It could have got better in the next 5 minutes. We call that the magic 5 minutes. Everybody thinks, I'm not going to call the CEO out because it's probably going to resolve itself in the next 5 minutes. So it's really important that people recognize that inertia is a real thing, and that's why you need proper triggers, proper escalation points, so that people have confidence in their ability to call out the CMT, whoever it might be. And of course, panic, adrenaline overload. You've got those three: fight, freeze, fight, or flight. Freeze is the most common of those. So making sure that we use action cards and flowcharts on all of those things in the exercise to give people the confidence to make sure that they are able to respond whilst in the middle of that adrenaline overload. Confusion, there is always going to be 5 minutes of chaos. And when we talk about the start of an exercise, especially a new one for a new team or a team that's never experienced an incident before, you're going to have the headless chicken period, whatever it might be. When people try and find their plan at 3 o'clock in the morning, it's not on their phone. The dog ate the plan, or people are just not available. So you get who you get in an instant response. And I think often we think about the the perfect team. It may well be the perfect team is more than likely the perfect team is not available. So just making sure that that we are aware of and we embrace the chaos. And then, of course, you have fear of the unknown, fear of failure, having the wrong people in the room, making sure that people are confident that it's a normal reaction and that failure in this exercise is a totally normal thing. We don't have to be concerned about it. It's not a pass or fail effort. We're all here to learn. And if we all make fools of ourselves, that's absolutely fine. And then lastly, of course, instinct, knee-jerk reactions. So, of course, we need to make sure that we are aware of it, that people will act on a lack of data, people will do things instinctively, and that's just part of the course. That's why it's important to have making sure that this links back to good business continuity planning. And then, of course, people get excited and they get energized about an incident and an incident exercise. So making sure that we embrace that as well, because there may well be people who take the opportunity to rise and shine and be the most interesting person in the room. And that's obviously, of course, fine as well. And it's important to make sure that we recognize that. And lastly, I'm just going to speed up because we're running up on time. Around exercise evaluation, make sure that you have a way of objectively measuring an exercise. So did the exercise meet its defined objectives? And obviously we can use surveys for that. We can use feedback. We all had a happy sheet that probably we didn't fill in because it was boring. But making sure that the questions are interesting questions, that we give them in a format that they can take away, that they can share with their team, that they can take time to fill in that evaluation, and so that they really understand the importance of it. And it's not just a tick box, didn't we do well? Making sure that we have good KPIs and metrics. How we measure this is really important so that we know that the exercise was successful. We've thought about in advance what KPIs that we use to measure, etc. And I'll just go through the rest of these. The scenario, making sure that we have realism in the scenario, making sure there is an avenue for communications and feedback, understanding that communications can be an issue, the whisper game, the if you like, the whisper confusion and distortion is a real thing, and making sure that we think about that when we're running an exercise. Thinking about how well participants and exercise attendees had responded to unexpected developments. And again, all about improvements and outputs, making sure that we capture everything from a corrective action perspective or an improvement perspective. And then, of course, making sure we have the availability to share all that with internal audit or external audit, or whoever it is who's a part of our governance, to make sure that we can demonstrate that the exercise was effective. So I've probably run over a little bit. I apologize for that, but I'll be very happy to take questions. Or, of course, if you have any questions you want me to feedback at a later date, either by email or online, I can certainly do that.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much for this informative presentation, and to our audience for attending today. Thank you so much for sending in questions. And since we're just about at the end of time, Riskonnect will be working with Andrew to address your questions offline. A recording from today's session will be made available on our magazine's website, continuityinsights.com, and it will also be available on riskonnect.com/content library by Monday. And as a closing note, the early bird discount for next month's Continuity Insights New York conference expires tomorrow, Friday, September 6th. For more information on that, please visit continuityinsights.com/CINY. Thank you everyone so much, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.